On behalf of the Grosse Pointe Public Schools Board of Education and our superintendent, Dr. Gary Niehaus, I extend our warmest welcome and appreciation for your presence this evening. We gather here tonight to commemorate Dr. Martin Luther King's visit to the Grosse Pointe communities. It was from this very gym, this very stage, that Dr. King delivered his speech, The Other America, exactly 50 years ago today. Tonight's commemoration would not be possible without the many community partners and countless individuals who worked tirelessly to make this event a reality. I'd like to acknowledge the support of several groups: the parent organizations from our elementary and middle schools, the Grosse Pointe North Parent Club, Grosse Pointe South Mothers Club, our Grosse Pointe Board of Realtors, Grosse Pointe Foundation for Public Education, our Grosse Pointe Historical Society, the Detroit Historical Society, and our amazing workforce of Grosse Pointe teachers, support staff, and administrators for their time, effort, planning, and dedication. And certainly last but not least, off to the side over here, Maureen Burr, the Director of Secondary Education for our school district. Maureen, you helped bring this whole event together. You coordinated with a myriad of personnel and found meaningful ways to have this event touch students at all levels. You often say, together we can, and as I look at this room, together we have. So thank you, Maureen. Lastly, I want to thank our wonderful students for thoughtfully reflecting and engaging in our prompts and themes at all levels throughout our district. Your work, which is on display in the library, is nothing short of inspiring and simply beautiful. At this time, I'd like to introduce Bob Burry, who will serve as our host for tonight's program. Since attending kindergarten at Papard Elementary, Bob has lived most of his life in this area and has been engaged in a wide range of business, nonprofit, and community efforts. Bob volunteers as a president of the Grosse Pointe Foundation for Public Education, and for nearly 17 years has served as the executive director and CEO of the Detroit Historical Society, the nonprofit organization that operates the Detroit Historical Museum, where the award-winning Detroit 67 Looking Back to Move Forward exhibition is on display. What occurred in Detroit and across America in 1967 was likely one of the reasons Dr. King elected to come to Grosse Pointe in 1968. And we are pleased to have Bob and the Detroit Historical Society's participation in tonight's program. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Bob Burry to the podium.
Thank you, Mr. Homka, Dr. Niehaus, and everyone that was mentioned who helped make tonight possible. And as Musa mentioned, the hundreds of students who created the essays and the artwork and all the creative forms of expression to commemorate this anniversary. It's really quite extraordinary. As mentioned, I'm Bob Burry, and I with the Grosse Pointe Foundation for Public Education and the Detroit Historical Society, and just as a resident of this community for a good long time, it's really my privilege to be part of tonight's program. 50 years ago, history was made, and again tonight, we make history as we gather. People of different ages, backgrounds, and experiences to engage with each other and reflect on the night Dr. Martin Luther King visited Grosse Pointe, but also to reflect on our community, in our world today, and by doing so, perhaps better understand each other and how we can move forward to realize our full potential. Now, some of the students may not agree, but history isn't about memorizing dates and facts for a test, but rather it's about looking back to learn about what came before, so we, especially the students and young people here tonight, can find our place in the present and inspire the future. Tonight, join me and the rest of the community in looking back to March 14th, 1968, as we remember a night that will never be forgotten in Grosse Pointe, by recalling what Dr. King said precisely 50 years ago, at this very time, in this very place, and I understand at some point in sitting in that very chair. So with that, sit back, enjoy, which I think you'll find a very inspiring evening, And before we start with the reading of the speech, we're going to take a quick look at a video that was produced locally by the students today.
So Martin Luther King was going to speak in Grosse Pointe, and there was concern about safety. Remember, this was the 60s, so when my mother, my Aunt Hilda, and my sister were going to go, there had to be a man to go, you know, to protect the women folk in case there was trouble. But my father wouldn't go.
What impressed us was it was a terrible blizzard. People had to park a mile away to get there. And it was very, very crowded. I suppose they wondered whether it would be or not.
The crowd was angry, mean. I've never experienced that before. I grew up, my mother and father were very cosmo, as you would say, because their friends were of all colors. So I never experienced racism. And to experience that hatred, that feeling that they hated me because of my color, as a teenager, I couldn't get over that. And we were afraid because they were throwing bottles at us and they were just saying nasty, evil things.
We had been listening to the news reports and following all the racial problems, and we knew that Dr. King was one who would promote a peaceful resolution to our problems instead of with all the violence. And so, of course, when it was announced that he was coming, we had to be there to listen to him.
And when he pulled into South High, I opened the door for him, and he was sitting in the back seat, and the police chief had his legs over him. He was laying down, so he couldn't be seen. His legs covered him. Many police, high security area. It was quite an experience.
In 1968, I was in 10th grade here at South. Then it was the High. And I was a student photography nerd at the time. And I got the opportunity to get a press pass to photograph Dr. King that evening, which was an incredible, incredible privilege. I have a feeling Mr. Garrick, the principal at the time, had something to do with it. So I was excited, and having a father as a minister was especially exciting for me, and I was sort of wondering if he was as strict with his kids as my dad was with me.
So before Martin Luther King gave his speech, a well-known rabble-rouser by the name of Donald Lobsinger, who belonged to a group called Break Things, marched down the main aisle, trailed by his 300-pound bodyguard. There was tension in the auditorium, as this was the kind of thing that started trouble. And Donald Lobsinger stopped right by the main stage as Martin Luther King was at the dais trying to start his speech, and started to harangue Martin Luther King with complaints like, "America, love it or leave it," and "We don't need communists."
Dr. King was incredibly, incredibly poised, dynamic speaker. I don't think I've ever seen another speaker with his power of, just a power of captivating, just a totally captivating speaker.
So when the rabble-rouser was taunting Martin Luther King with his insults, I leaned over the railing and started to yell at him. I yelled things like, "We didn't come here to hear you." And to my surprise and chagrin, Martin Luther King motioned me with his arm to sit down and let the man have his say.
That Martin Luther King taught us how to share a concern with other people.
And yet today we're still dealing with civil rights issues, a little bit different perhaps, but nevertheless they're.
I hope that people in Grosse Pointe understand that our biggest challenges here are accepting diversity of thought and dealing with diversity of income. I think we have a responsibility as a school system to equalize the opportunities that kids have
What I gathered from that night, the lasting impression, was racism. As I said before, I never really experienced it on a one-on-one basis. But that night, I realized that people really hated me because of the color of my skin. That's a lasting impression for a kid.
Sense that despite having a PhD, it took me years to understand the relevance of his beautiful wisdom of teaching. He preached nonviolence as a moral imperative in combating social ills of the day. And he counseled me to calm down and let the man have his say. He practiced what he preached.
We have to work hard. We have to live with one another, make compromises, and we have to try to be kind to one another.
Everything is a learning experience. No matter what it is, bad or good, it's a learning experience. It is your decision how it's going to affect you, and you carry it on.
Well, as I said earlier, history is not memorizing dates and times, but it's really real stories of real people. And certainly those are some amazing stories there that really told the story very effectively of what happened 50 years ago. But we want to hear what was said. And to begin or continue today's program, we're going to be reading the speech that Dr. King gave. And to start with the reading, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Brian Summerfield, who is the president of the Grosse Pointe Board of Education, who's going to start us off.
Reverend Dr. Harry Meserve, Bishop Emmerich, my dear friend Congressman Conyers, ladies and gentlemen, I need not pause to say how very delighted I am to be here tonight and to have the great privilege of discussing with you some of the vital issues confronting our nation and confronting the world. It is always a very rich and rewarding experience when I can take a brief break from the day-to-day demands of our struggle for freedom and human dignity and discuss the issues involved in that struggle with concerned people of goodwill all over our nation and all over the world. And I certainly want to express my deep personal appreciation to you for inviting me to occupy the significant platform. I want to discuss the race problem tonight, and I want to discuss it very honestly. I still believe that freedom is the bonus you receive for telling the truth. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And I do not see how we will ever solve the turbulent problem of race confronting our nation until there is an honest confrontation with it, and a willing search for the truth, and a willingness to admit the truth when we discover it. And so I want to use as a title for my lecture tonight, The Other America. And I use this title because there are literally two Americas. Every city in our country has this kind of dualism, this schizophrenia, split at so many parts, and so every city ends up being two cities rather than one. There are two Americas. One America is beautiful for situation. In this America, millions of people have the milk of prosperity and the honey of equality flowing before them. This America is the habitat of millions of people who have food and material necessities for their bodies, culture and education for their minds, freedom and human dignity for their spirits. In this America, children grow up in the sunlight of opportunity. But there is another America. This America has a daily ugliness about it that transforms the buoyancy of hope into the fatigue of despair. In this other America, thousands and thousands of people, men in particular, walk the streets and search for jobs that do not exist. In this other America, millions of people are forced to live in vermin-filled, distressing housing conditions where they do not have the privilege of having wall-to-wall carpeting, but all too often, they end up with wall-to-wall rats and roaches. Almost 40% of the Negro families of America live in substandard housing conditions. In this other America, thousands of young people are deprived of an opportunity to get an adequate education. Every year, thousands finish high school reading at a 7th, 8th, and sometimes 9th grade level. Not because they're dumb, not because they don't have the native intelligence, but because the schools are so inadequate, so overcrowded, so devoid of quality, so segregated, if you will, that the best in these minds can never come out. Probably the most critical problem in the other America is the economic problem. There are so many other people in the other America who can never make ends meet because their incomes are far too low, if they have incomes, and their jobs are so devoid of quality. And so in this other America, unemployment is a reality, and underemployment is a reality. I'll just wait until things are restored and everybody talks about law and order.
Now, before I was so rudely interrupted, and I might say that it was my understanding that we're going to have a question and answer period. And if anybody disagrees with me, you will have the privilege, the opportunity to raise a question if you think I'm a traitor. Then you'll have an opportunity to ask me about my traitorness, and we will give you that opportunity. Now, let me get back to the point that I was trying to bring out about the economic problem. And that is one of the most critical problems that we face in America today. We find in the other America, unemployment constantly rising to astronomical proportions, and Black people generally find themselves living in a literal depression. All too often, when there is mass unemployment in the Black community, it is referred to as a social problem. And when there is mass unemployment in the white community, it is referred to as a depression. But there is no basic difference. The fact is that the Negro faces a literal depression all over the U.S. The unemployment rate on the basis of statistics from the Labor Department is about 8.8% in the Black community. But these statistics only take under consideration individuals who were once in the labor market or individuals who go to employment offices to seek employment. But they do not take under consideration the thousands of people who have given up, who have lost motivation, the thousands of people who have had so many doors closed in their faces that they feel defeated and they no longer go out to look for jobs, the thousands who've come to feel that life is a long and desolate corridor with no exit signs. These people are considered the discouraged. And when you add the discouraged to the individuals who can't be calculated through statistics in the unemployment category, the unemployment rate in the Negro community probably goes to 16 or 17%. And among Black youth, it is in some communities as high as 40 and 45%. But the problem of unemployment is not the only problem. There is a problem of underemployment, and there are thousands and thousands, I would say millions of people in the Negro community who are poverty-stricken, not because they are not working, but because they receive wages so low that they cannot begin to function in the mainstream of the economic life of our nation. Most of the poverty-stricken people of America are persons who are working every day, and they end up getting part-time wages for full-time work. So the vast majority of Negroes in America find themselves perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. This has caused a great deal of bitterness. It has caused a great deal of agony. It has caused ache and anguish. It has caused great despair. And we have seen the angered expression of this despair and this bitterness in the violent rebellions that have taken place in cities all over our country. Now, I think my views on nonviolence are pretty generally known. I still believe that nonviolence is the most potent weapon available to the Negro in his struggles for justice and freedom in the U.S.
Now, let me relieve you a bit. I've been in the struggle a long time now, and I've conditioned myself to some things that are much more painful than discourteous people not allowing you to speak. So if they feel that they can discourage me, they'll be up here all night. Now, I wanted to say something about the fact that we have lived over these last 2 or 3 summers with agony, and that we have seen our cities going up in flames. And I would be the first to say that I am still committed to militant, powerful, massive nonviolence as the most potent weapon in grappling with the problem from a direct action point of view. I'm absolutely convinced that a riot merely intensifies the fears of the white community while relieving the guilt. And I feel that we must always work with an effective, powerful weapon and method that brings about tangible results. But it is not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without, at the same time, condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention. And I must say tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last 12 or 15 years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity.
Now, every year about this time, our newspapers, our televisions, and people generally start talking about the long, hot summer ahead. What always bothers me is that the long, hot summer has always been preceded by a long, cold winter. And the great problem is that the nation has not used its winters creatively enough to develop a program, to develop the kind of massive acts of concern that will bring about a solution to the problem. And so, we must still face the fact that our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. As long as justice is postponed, we always stand on the verge of these darker nights of social disruption. The question now is whether America is preparing to do something massively, affirmatively, and forthrightly about the great problem we face in the area of race and the problem which can bring the curtain of doom down on American civilization, if it is not solved. And I would like to talk for the next few minutes about some of the things that must be done if we are to solve this problem.
The first thing that I would like to mention is that there must be recognition on the part of that everybody in this nation that America is still a racist country. Now, however unpleasant that sounds, it is the truth. And we will never solve the problem of racism until there is a recognition of the fact that racism still stands at the center of so much of our nation, and we must see racism for what it is. It is the nymph of the inferior people. It is the notion that one group has all the knowledge and all the insight, all the purity, all the work, and all the dignity. And another group is worthless and on a lower level of humanity, inferior. To put it in philosophical language, racism is not based on some empirical generalization, which after some studies would come to the conclusion that these people are behind because of environmental conditions. Racism is based on an ontological affirmation. It is the notion that the very being of people is inferior, and that their ultimate logic of racism is genocide. Hitler was a very sick man. He was one of the greatest tragedies of history, but he was very honest. He took his racism to its logical conclusion. The minute his racism caused him to sickly feel and go about saying that there was something inadequately inferior about the Jews, he ended up killing 6 million Jews. The ultimate logic of racism is genocide. And if one says that one is not good enough to have a job that is a solid quality job, if one is not good enough to have access to public accommodation, if one is not good enough to have the right to vote, if one is not good enough to live next door to him, if one is not good enough to marry his daughter because of his race, then at that moment, that person is saying that that person who is not good to do all of it, all of this is not fit to exist or to live. And that is the ultimate logic of racism. And we've got to see that this still exists in America's society. And until it is removed, there will be people walking the streets of life and living in their humble dwellings, feeling that they are nobody, feeling that they have no dignity, and feeling that they are not respected. The first thing that must be on the agenda of our nation is to get rid of racism.
Secondly, we've got to get rid of 2 or 3 myths that still pervade our nation. One is the myth of time. I'm sure you've heard of this notion. It is the notion that only time can solve the problem of racial injustice. And I've heard it from many sincere people. They've said to the Negro and to its allies in the white community, you should slow up. You're pushing things too fast. Only time can solve the problem. They've said, and if you will just be nice and patient and pray, in 100 or 200 years, the problem will work itself out. There is an answer to that myth. It is that time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And I'm sad to say to you tonight, I'm absolutely convinced that the forces of ill will in our nation, the forces on the wrong side in our nation, the extreme righteous of our nation, have often used time more effectively than that of the forces of goodwill. And it may well be that we may have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words of the bad people who will say bad things in a meeting like this, or who will bomb a church in Birmingham, Alabama, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere, we must come to see that human progress sits around, never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals who are willing to be co-workers with God, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so, we must always help time and realize that time is always right to do right.
Now, there is another myth, and that is the notion that legislation can't solve the problem, that you've got to change the heart, and naturally, I believe in changing the heart. I happen to be a Baptist preacher, and that puts me in the heart-changing business. And Sunday after Sunday, I'm preaching about conversion and the need for the new birth and regeneration. I believe that there's something wrong with human nature. I believe in original sin, not in terms of the historical event, but as the mythological category to explain the universality of evil. So I'm honest enough to see the gone wrongness of human nature. So naturally, I'm not against changing the heart. And I do feel that that is the half-truth involved here, that there is some truth in the whole question of changing the heart. We're not going to have the kind of society that we should have until the white person treats the Negro right, not because the law says it, but because it's natural, because it's right, and because the black man is the white man's brother. I'll be the first to say that we will never have a truly integrated society, a truly colorless society, until men and women are obedient to the unenforceable. But after saying that, let me point out the other side. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law can't make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me. And I think that's pretty important also. And so while legislation may not change the hearts of men, it does change the habits of men when it's vigorously enforced. And when you change the habits of people, pretty soon attitudes begin to be changed, and people begin to see that they can do things that fears cause them to feel that they could never do. And I say that there's a need still for strong civil rights legislation in various areas. There's legislation in Congress right now dealing with the whole question of housing and equal administration of justice, and these things are very important. For I submit to you tonight that there is no more dangerous development in our nation than the constant building up of predominantly Negro central cities ringed by white suburbs. This will do nothing but invite social disaster, and this problem has to be dealt with, some through legislation, some through education, but it has to be dealt with in a very concrete and meaningful manner. Now let me get back to my point. I'm going to finish my speech. I've been trying to think about what I'm going to preach about tomorrow down to Central Methodist Church in the Lenten series, and I think I'll use as the text, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do."
I want to deal with another myth, briefly, which concerns me, and I want to talk about it very honestly, and that is over-reliance on the bootstrap philosophy. Now, certainly, it's very important for people to engage in self-help programs and do all they can to lift themselves by their own bootstraps. Now, I'm not talking against that at all. I think there's a great deal that the black people of this country must do for themselves, and nobody else can do for them. And we must see the other side of this question. I remember the other day I was on a plane and a man started talking with me, and he said, "I'm sympathetic toward what you're trying to do, but I just feel that you people don't do enough for yourself." And then he went on to say that my problem is, my concern is, that I know of other ethnic groups, many of the ethnic groups that came to this country, and they had problems just as Negroes, and yet they did the job for themselves. They lifted themselves by their own bootstraps. Why is it that the Negroes can't do that? And I looked at him, and I tried to talk as understandingly as possible, and I said to him, "It does not help the Negro for unfeeling, sensitive white people to say that other ethnic groups that came to the country, maybe 100 or 150 years, voluntarily have gotten ahead of them. And he was brought here in chains involuntarily almost 350 years ago." I said it doesn't help him to be told that. And then I went on to say to this gentleman that he failed to recognize that no other ethnic group has ever been enslaved on American soil. Then I had to go on to say to him that you failed to realize that America made the black man's color a stigma, something that he couldn't change. Not only was the color a stigma, but even linguistic, then stigmatic, conspired against the black man so that his color was thought of as something very evil. If you open Roget's Thesaurus and notice the synonym for black people, you find about 120, and most of them represent something dirty, smut, degrading, low. And when you turn to the synonym for white people, about 130, all of them represent something high, pure, chaste. You go right down that list. And so in the language, a white life is better than a black life. Just follow. If somebody goes wrong in the family, we don't call him a white sheep, we call him a black sheep. And then if you block somebody from getting somewhere, you don't say that they've been white-balled, you say that they've been black-balled. And just go down the line. It's not white male, it's black male. I tell you this to seriously say that the nation made the black man's color a stigma. And then I had to say to my friend on the plane another thing that is often forgotten in this country, that nobody, no ethnic group has completely lifted itself by its own bootstraps. I can never forget that the black man was free from the bondage of physical slavery in 1863. But he wasn't given any land to make that freedom meaningful after being held in slavery 244 years. And it was like keeping a man in prison for many, many years, and then coming to see that he is not guilty of the crime for which he was convicted. All right, good night, and God bless you.
And I was about to say that to have freed the Negro from slavery without doing anything to get him started in life on a sound economic footing, it was almost like freeing a man who had been in prison many years, and you had discovered that he had been unjustly convicted of, that he was innocent of the crime for which he was convicted. And you go up to him and you say, now you're free. But you don't give him any bus fare to get to town. And you don't give him any money to buy some clothes to put on his back or to get started in life again. Every code of jurisprudence would rise up against it. This is the very thing that happened to the black man in America. And then, when we look at it even deeper than this, it becomes more ironic. We are reaping the harvest of this failure today. While America refused to do anything for the black man at that point, during that very period, the nation, through an act of Congress, was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant it was willing to undergird the peasants from Europe with an economic floor. Not only did they give the land, but they built land-grant colleges for them to learn how to farm. Not only that, it provided county agents to further their expertise in farming, and went beyond this and came to the point of providing low interest rates for these persons so they could mechanize their farms. And today, many of these persons are being paid millions of dollars in subsidies not to farm. And these are so often the very people saying to the black man that he must lift himself up by his own bootstraps. I can never think. Senator Eastland, incidentally, who says this all the time, gets $125,000 a year not to farm on various areas of his plantation down in Mississippi. And yet, he feels we must do everything for ourselves. Well, that appears to me to be a kind of socialism for the rich and rugged, hard, individualistic capitalism for the poor. Now, let me say two other things, and I'm going to rush on. One, I want to say that if we're to move ahead and solve this problem, we must reorder our national priorities. Today, we are spending almost $35 billion a year to fight what I consider an unjust, ill-conceived, evil, costly, and unwinnable war at Vietnam. I wish I had time to go into the dimension of this, but I must say that the war in Vietnam is playing havoc with our domestic destinies. That war has torn up our Geneva Accord. It has strengthened, it has substituted. All right, if you wish to speak, I'll let you come down and speak and I'll wait. You can give your Vietnam speech now and then listen to mine. Come right on. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Joseph McLaughlin, U.S. Navy, United States of America, and I fought for freedom. I didn't fight for communism, traitors, and I didn't fight to be sold down the drain, not by Romney, Kavanaugh, Johnson, nobody. Nobody's going to sell me down the drain. Many thanks.
All right, thank you very much. I just want to say in response to that there are those of us who oppose the war in Vietnam. I feel like opposing it for many reasons. Many of them are moral reasons, but one basic reason is that we love our boys who are fighting there, and we just want them to come back home. but I don't have time to go into the history and development of the war in Vietnam. I happen to be a pacifist, but if I had had to make a decision about fighting the war against Hitler, I may have given up my pacifism. I may have temporarily given up my pacifism and taken up arms. But nobody is to compare what is happening in Vietnam today with that. I am convinced that it is clearly an unjust war and is doing so many things, not only on the domestic scene, it is carrying the whole world closer to nuclear annihilation. And so I found it necessary to take a stand against the war in Vietnam. And I appreciate Bishop Emmerich's question, and I must answer it by saying that for me, the two of us cannot be divided. It's nice to talk about for me. It's nice for me to talk about. It's all right to talk about integrated schools and integrated lunch counters, which I will continue to work for, but I think it would be rather absurd for me to work for integrated schools and not be concerned about the survival of the world in which to integrate. The other thing is that I have been working too long and too hard now against segregated public accommodations to end up at this stage of my life segregating my moral concern. I must make it clear, for me, justice is indivisible. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
And now for the question of hurting civil rights. I think the war in Vietnam hurt civil rights much more than my taking a stand against the war. And I could point out so many things to say that a reporter asked me some time ago. When I first took a strong stand against the war, didn't I feel that I would have to reverse my position because so many people disagreed? And people who once had respect for me wouldn't have respect. And this reporter, he went on to say that, I hear it's hurt the budget of your organization. And don't you think that you have to get in line with more the administration's policy? And of course, those were very lonely days. When I first started speaking out, and not many people were speaking out, but now I have a lot of company, and it's not as lonesome now. But anyway, I had to say to the reporter, I'm sorry, sir, but you don't know me. I am not a consensus leader, and I do not determine what is right and wrong by looking at the budget of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or by taking a look at a Gallup poll and getting the expression of the majority opinion. Ultimately, a genuine leader is not a sucker for consensus, but a mold of consensus. And on some positions, cowardness asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politics? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? The conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politics, nor popular, but he must do it because conscience tells him it is right.
Now, the time is passing, and I was going into the need for direct action and dramatize and call attention to the gulf between promise and fulfillment. I've been searching for a long time for an alternative to riots on the one hand and timid supplication for justice on the other. And I think that alternative is found in militant, massive nonviolence. I'll wait until the question period before going into the Washington campaign, but let me say that it has been my experience in these years that I've been in the struggle for justice that things just don't happen until the issue is dramatized in a massive, direct action way. I will never forget when we came through Washington in 1964, in December, coming from Oslo. I stopped by to see President Johnson. We talked about a lot of things, and we finally got to the point of talking about voting rights. The president was concerned about voting, but he said, Martin, I can't get this through in this session of Congress. We can't get a voting rights bill. He said, because there are 2 or 3 other things that I feel that we've got to get through, and they're going to benefit the Negroes as much as anything. One was the education bill and something else. And then he went on to say that if I push a voting rights bill now, I'll lose the support of 7 congressmen that I sorely need for the particular things that I had, and we just can't get it. Well, I went on to say to the president that I felt that we had to do something about it, and 2 weeks later we started a movement in Selma, Alabama. We started dramatizing the issue that the denial of the right to vote, and I submit to you that 3 months later, as a result of that Selma movement, the same president who said to me that we could not get a voting rights bill in the session of Congress was on the television singing through a speaking voice, "We shall overcome," and calling for the passage of a voting rights bill. And I could go on to show, and we did get a voting rights bill in that session of Congress. Now, I could go on to give many other examples to show that it just doesn't come about without pressure. And this is what we plan to do in Washington. We aren't planning to close down Washington. We aren't planning to close down Congress. This isn't anywhere in our plans. We are planning to dramatize the issue to the point that poor people in this nation will have to be seen and will not be invisible.
Now let me finally say something in the realm of the Spirit, and then I'm going to take my seat. Let me say finally that in the midst of the hollering and in the midst of the discourtesy tonight, we got to come to see that however much we dislike it, the destinies of white and black America are tied together. Now, the races don't understand this apparently, but our destinies are tied together. And somehow, we must all learn to live together as brothers in this country, or we're all going to perish together as fools. Our destinies are tied together. Whether we like it or not, culturally and otherwise, every white person is a little bit Negro, and every Negro is a little bit white. Our language, our music, our material prosperity, and even our food are an amalgam of black and white, so there can be no separate black path to power and fulfillment that does not intersect white routes, and there can ultimately be no separate white path to power and fulfillment, short of social disaster, without recognizing the necessity of sharing that power with black aspirations for freedom and human dignity. We must come to see, yes, we do need each other. The black man needs the white man to save him from his fear, and the white man needs the black man to free him from his guilt.
John Donne was right. No man is an island, and the tide that fills every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And he goes on toward the end to say, any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind. Therefore, it is not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Somehow, we must come to see that in this pluralistic, interrelated society, we are all tied together in a single garment of destiny, caught in a power that must be shared, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And by working with determination and realizing that power must be shared, I think we can solve this problem. And may I say in conclusion that our goal is freedom, and I believe we're going to get there. It's going to be much more difficult from here on in, but I believe we're going to get there because however much she strays away from it, the goal of America is freedom, and our destiny is tied with the destiny of America. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before Jefferson etched across the pages of history the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. Before the beautiful words of the Star-Spangled Banner were written, we were here. And for more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored here without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of their masters in the midst of the most humiliating and oppressive conditions. And yet, out of a bottomless vitality, they continued to grow and develop. And if the inexpressible cruelties of slavery couldn't stop us, the opposition that we now face, including the white backlash, will surely fall.
We are going to win our freedom
because both the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands. And so, however difficult it is during this period, however difficult it is to continue to live with agony and the continued existence of racism, however difficult it is to live amidst the constant hurt and the constant insult and the constant disrespect, I can still sing, "We shall overcome." We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We shall overcome because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed to earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell is right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future. We shall overcome because the Bible is right. You shall reap what you sow. And with this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to speed up the day when all of God's children all over this nation, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last."
I want to thank you for your attention tonight and for everyone that took an opportunity to read part of the speech tonight. If you heard the speech that Dr. King made for the first time tonight, or if you're familiar with it, I think you'll agree it's very, very powerful. Many of the insights and observations Dr. King provides are as present and relevant today as they were 50 years ago. After 5 decades, the other America continues to exist for many across our country, and even for some in our own community. A lot to think about. To close out the program tonight, this portion of the program, it's my pleasure to introduce Brenda Tyndall. Brenda leads our education efforts at the Detroit Historical Society and is very excited to be part of the program tonight. She is a nationally recognized historian and author and has studied the work of Dr. Martin Luther King very extensively. Tonight, Brenda will share her reflections on the meanings of Dr. King's The Other America speech and why its message continues to be an important one for us today. Brenda?
Thank you, Bob, for that thoughtful introduction, and thanks to the Grosse Pointe school administrators for the invitation to participate in tonight's program. I once heard someone say, quote, "Great places have 2 things, confidence and a sense of continuity. Both are gained by a sense of the past," end quote. Tonight, as we commemorate Dr. Martin Luther King's historic visit to Grosse Pointe 50 years ago, the past is palpable, and the promise of a future built by confidence and a sense of continuity is evident as we bask in the talent, brilliance, and artistic expression of Grosse Pointe Public School students and the community of teachers, parents, and stakeholders here this evening. In many ways, tonight is a requiem for Dr. King, who was an unrelenting advocate for civil and human rights, an apostle of nonviolence, a decorated theologian, an intellectual, a global citizen, a Nobel Peace Prize recipient, and at the end of the day, he was a son, a brother, a father, a husband, and a man who believed our country had the capacity to go from two Americas, deeply stratified along race and class lines, to a beloved community defined by justice, equity, an appreciation of difference, and an inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. Dr. King's The Other America speech, delivered here in Grosse Pointe on March 14, 1968, is significant for several reasons. I'll share three of them this evening. First, it invites us to think about the social and political climate of 1968. Though the Herculean efforts of the civil rights movement yielded tangible results by the mid-60s, American race relations remained tender at best. Additionally, in 1968, we had the glare of the Vietnam War. College campuses became active theaters of protest, and poverty levels reached new lows in America's urban and rural centers, as wealth and privilege seemed to thrive in suburban enclaves. Such realities provided King with ample material as he crafted his searing critique of the Other America phenomenon. Moreover, King's visit to Grosse Pointe was preceded by the long, hot summer of 1967, a period marked by spasms of violence and urban unrest throughout the United States, and of course, here in Detroit. Given such context, it is not surprising that the triple burdens of racism, poverty, and militarism emerged as prominent themes in King's Other America address, themes that deeply informed his continuous stride toward a more just and equitable society. Secondly, the Other America speech symbolizes a critical pivot in King's social justice ministry. For so many Americans, our understanding of Dr. King is limited to the lofty ideas, poetic cadence, and eloquence of his I Have a Dream speech, which he delivered at the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. After all, who could forget how he laid bare his own humanity and dreams when he states, quote, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today," end quote. I have no doubt King continued to have this dream. But by 1968, with the passage of landmark civil rights legislation, King's social justice ministry had evolved. He became increasingly attentive to issues such as fair housing practices, workers' rights, and economic conditions throughout the South, and especially in the urban North. Such efforts culminated with the Poor People's Campaign, for instance, an effort that broadened King's social justice agenda to include the day-to-day plight of working class and poor communities. In fact, some of the most transformative work in this regard took place in neighboring Chicago, where he labored diligently to combat substandard public housing conditions and discriminatory employment policies, to name a few. Even as King's social justice agenda shifted course, his strategy remained unshakable, which leads to the third reason his visit to Grosse Pointe and Other America speech is deeply important. In The Other America, King offers an unapologetic critique of our nation's race conundrum and its impact on the human condition. But this speech is more than a survey of our country's social and economic dilemmas. Inherent in King's message is the vision of a beloved community. It is a community in which racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice are replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood, brotherhood, and humanity. It is a community that resolves social, economic, and political conflicts together through a mutual and determined commitment to nonviolence. It is a community that ensures all children, to use King's words, grow up in the sunlight of opportunity, and no one is subjected to the fatigue of despair. In close, one of the most productive ways we can honor King's legacy and commemorate his visit to Grosse Pointe is to acknowledge that the other America continues in the 21st century. And instead of retreating from the specter of two Americas, let's work together to heed King's clarion call for a beloved community. Thank you.
Thank you again, Brenda. My name is John Dean. I'm the Deputy Superintendent for Educational Services in this wonderful school district. I'm also, probably more important than that, I'm a dad here in this very community. As was talked about, as Brenda shared with us, Dr. King asked that question, is there another America? Is the other America? What is that? We thought we would ask that of our students. So this evening, I'm here to share with you and to talk about with you briefly what you hopefully saw in the Wicking Library in South before this event this evening. Our students across the district tried to answer that question. What is the other America? Does it exist? What is that all about? If you didn't get a chance to see that, I encourage you after our event this evening to go to the library and see the amazing representations of the other America provided by our students. To give you some idea of exactly what happened, each of our elementary students in all 9 of our elementary schools was tasked with doing work around the concept of courage. At the secondary level, our students were asked to address, is there still an other America? And to make it incredibly challenging for the students, that was it. There were no other directions. They weren't given a medium they had to use. They could write an essay. They could write a poem. They could create a piece of art. They could create a video, an example of music. And we're fortunate in this community, through the generosity of our various parent organizations, that we were able to identify and provide some awards for the top finishers to answer that question, what is the other America? So this evening, I'm proud to announce our various student winners from the Grosse Pointe Public Schools for these awards. Please hold your applause as I read the 9 students who are identified as 4th place winners in this contest. We have Anna Magny, Sophie Clemens, Eva Taranis, Brooklyn Northcross, Jordan Hunter, Christina Rogers, Riley Lynch, Rockham Williamson, and Sebastian Cubiejo. If any of you are here, would you please stand and be recognized? Thank you. And now here's where it gets confusing. There was one 3rd place prize for $500 actually, but it's split between the 5 people that all worked together collaboratively. So I'm a recovering math teacher, so they're each going to get $100, okay? And these 5 students, I believe all from Pierce Middle School, are as follows. So let's hold our applause. Let me get through all 5 of these names. First we have J. Lauren Deering, Owen Domzalski, Ashlyn Johnson, Luke Maisho, and Emma Stricker. Are any of you here this evening? Congratulations. We have a 2nd place winner with a $750 award, and that's Naomi Ozamore. Naomi, are you here? Yes, right in the back. And I should have pointed out, somebody asked me before this, how many secondary entries were there? We had over 300 secondary entries, to give you an idea of this. And now we're at that point of identifying that one kind of grand prize person. They're going to get a $1,000 award, and I should have probably said this at the beginning. The kids are too polite to ask. We'll send you an email and figure out how to get this to you. Don't worry, okay? We'll contact you. But The winner, overall winner, as identified by the committee, is Soleil Garcia Johnson. Soleil here. Congratulations. This was a daunting task to make these decisions. They called me in at the end along with Dr. Niehaus and a couple of other people because they were stuck. And it was a very just a serious challenge to figure this piece out. Mr. Hampke began with a couple of thank yous, and then they've asked me to mention a couple of other thank yous. First, this whole entire evening was very moving to me, but one of the most moving parts was that video. The people that were here in 1968 and talked about their experience through that personal lens. And I know some of them were on the video, and there might even be others who are here this evening. If you were here that evening, 50 years ago this evening, could you please stand and be recognized? I know Ahmed is here. Oh, wow. You know, I guess we often think that history is something in the past until we have an evening like tonight and we realize history is right next to us. You know, I've worked with Ahmed for the last 6 years, and he and I have gone back and forth on a lot of things. But I mean, at the end of the day, he was part of something as an observer, as were the other 6 or 7 people that stood up just now, as were the hundreds before, a piece of history, not just Grosse Pointe history, but of our nation. A couple of other thank yous. I really want to once again recognize all the readers. You did an amazing job this evening. I want to thank and recognize all the volunteers, the musicians, and our lighting and sound staff that made this evening happen. Musa very correctly pointed out that we had this powerful organizing committee, of which Maureen Burr was one of the leaders. Would all the members of the organizing committee please stand and be recognized? It goes without saying, by the way, and most of you know this, some of you maybe didn't catch this piece. While Maureen led this, I really want to point out Rebecca Fannin made this night happen. I think she pretty much did, it seems like, all the pieces of this. Becky, where are you at right now? Thank you for your leadership, Becky. And last but not least, I'd like to recognize our Board of Education. We have many board members here this evening. If you're on the Board of Education, please stand and be recognized. Again, Ahmed, sorry. Judy, Kathy, Brian, thank you. And now I'd like to introduce our superintendent, Dr. Gary Niehaus, who is going to lead us in our closing activities. Gary?
You've got the 2 certificates? Yep. Are they down here?
Yeah.
Let me just tell you, honestly, tonight I'm proud to be the superintendent of Grosse Pointe Public Schools. I'm proud of the factor that I got the opportunity to listen to this tape through the Martin Luther King activity on his birthday for 2 consecutive years. Tonight it was different, but it was equally meaningful to have the readers and to see how it was divided out and how each one of you brought a different perspective to that speech. The other thing I thought about, because I lived during this time frame, and the other thing I thought about was, what if Reverend Martin Luther King would have had a lifetime? He wouldn't have been assassinated, and his dream could have perpetuated and taken us further. Not saying that we all didn't try to live out his dream, but more importantly, what if he lived a normal life? And what would have made a difference? What if his vision had a bigger catch? But I also, as I heard the couple talk in the video, what would have been like that night to ride into Grosse Pointe 50 years ago in the way he was brought in? Wouldn't it take a lot of courage? We talked about courage for what the students were going to write about courage. What kind of courage did it take for him to come here? And why would he come here? And why would he allow people to interrupt his speech and not be bothered or fazed by that? We've got to learn from him what that night was all about, but more importantly, what role we play as Americans today in 2018, and what is the courage we have to be able to take on those things in our life that are things that are still bothering or still hanging over our country. This whole racism piece you could have inserted several different things into his speech, and I really understand better that we haven't come as far as sometimes we think we have. And so do we have the courage as Grosse Pointe community, as a city of Detroit, as a state of Michigan, as the United States, to take on his dream and to do something with it? So first of all, I wanted to thank every one of you for coming out tonight. I do agree with John. This has gone from about last summer when Musa and I had the conversation with the Grosse Pointe Historical Society saying, what are you going to do and how much are you going to do? I think we showed you tonight what we can do and what we're willing to do, and I just congratulate the students, the faculty, my administrative team, the Board of Education, and all of the community that came out this evening. It means a lot to us to have you here and also to remember Dr. Martin Luther King. The last two things I wanted to do this evening is present something. So if I could get Bob Burry and Brenda to come back up, Tyndall to come back up. Would you both come up, please? And what I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to give both of you a certificate of recognition and appreciation for Brenda and Bob of the Detroit Historical Society for commemorating the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's speech at Grosse Pointe Public School System on this date, March 14th, 2018. And I wanted to give a certificate to each of you, and then to personally give you both, and I don't have two tonight, but I'll get those, just like John was going to email the checks, right? I'm going to give you both a picture. And this picture is Ahmed Ishmael's picture as the photographer that night. And Ahmed has generously given this picture to a lot of different people. And tonight we're going to take his picture in his honor to be able to pass this on individually to the two of you. And you can either personally take it or you can take it back to Detroit Historical Society, whichever you choose to do. It's your gift and you get to do it. So whatever you wanted to do. Thank you. With that, good night, safe travels. Thanks for coming. If you have the opportunity, go back over to the library and check out the artwork. Thank you, appreciate it.